America's attack on Venezuela is not an isolated incident. It is a part of a broader pattern in how the United States exercises power around the world. On the 3rd of Jan, US forces launched an attack against Venezuela, capturing President Nicolas Maduro and his wife in Caracas. The White House claims that it called this a move to restore democracy, stop criminal activity, blah, blah, blah. But knowing Trump and how he spells out exactly what is happening, he did in fact say out loud that the US plans to gain access to Venezuela's oil again and again and again. Critics across the world, including governments and international legal experts, call this a breach of international law and a threat to global peace. Many Latin American countries like Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and Spain said that the attack was a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty and risked regional instability. China and Russia described the action as a clear act of armed aggression that violates the United Nations Charter and sets a very dangerous precedent for smaller states. Since the attack, Donald Trump has openly discussed Venezuela's oil. He said the United States would control large amounts of Venezuelan crude and have it shipped to US ports. Trump even described the barrels of oil that may be transferred as controlled by me. He claimed that this would benefit both Venezuelans and Americans. This has raised alarm internationally because the move treats another nation's natural resources as if they belong to the United States. Critics say that this behavior violates Venezuela's right to sovereignty and could fuel instability. The United States did not just argue about the oil. In late 2025, Washington imposed a naval blockade around Venezuelan waters and seized tankers carrying oil, while also sanctioning Venezuelan oil companies and blocking tankers as part of pressure tactics. These actions dramatically reduced Venezuela's oil exports and have been described by Caracas as an act of piracy. As sanctions and blockades tightened, global institutions like the United Nations were called on to respond, but no effective legal enforcement has stopped the United States pressure campaign. When the United States prioritizes access to Venezuelan oil over respect for sovereignty, it sets a dangerous precedent because other nations watch and take notes. If one country can invade or manipulate another for resources without meaningful consequences, it erodes the rules that govern international conduct. Global institutions like the United Nations are sidelined or reduced to producing reports that do not affect any outcomes. Enforcement of international law becomes selective, and countries with resources suddenly face constant pressure from stronger powers, knowing that resistance can lead to intervention, sanctions, or worse. This is not theoretical. Venezuela is living this right now. The profits and benefits of this intervention are concentrated in American hands. Trump has said that major US energy companies will play a central role in rebuilding Venezuela's oil infrastructure and extracting its crude. US officials have discussed consulting with Chevron and other energy executives about investing billions into reviving Venezuela's aging oil fields, through though some analysts say that firms are cautious due to high costs and political instability. Chevron is currently the only big US company operating under a special license in Venezuela. And shares of US energy firms like Chevron, ExxonMobil, Halliburton, and Baker Hughes jumped in value after news of the operation or the attack. Trump has also announced that Venezuela will transfer between 30 and 50 million barrels of oil to the United States, with the proceeds under his control, at least initially. This move links US domestic oil interests directly into Venezuelan reserves. Of course, the government collects taxes and fees, politicians gain influence, and connected lobbyists profit too. Allied nations, including Canada, Brazil, the Netherlands, Japan, and the United Kingdom benefit indirectly through trade contracts, service provision, and financing. Even defense and technology sectors, such as Elon Musk's companies providing infrastructure support and satellite internet access in Venezuela, stand to gain increased contracts and geopolitical leverage. So the system is designed to extract wealth from Venezuela while giving almost nothing back to the Venezuelan people. Wealth leaves the country while local jobs, investment, and public services remain constrained. China has reacted strongly to the US attack on Venezuela. Beijing's government has publicly condemned the United States, saying that the military strikes and the capture of President Maduro violate international law and Venezuela's sovereignty. Chinese officials told the United Nations that these actions were unilateral, illegal, and bullying, and that they threaten peace in Latin America and beyond. China also called on the United States to stop toppling the Venezuelan government, to respect the UN Charter, and to return to dialogue and negotiation with Venezuela's leaders. China is one of Venezuela's biggest oil buyers and investors, so losing access to Venezuelan crude and seeing US forces remove Maduro has now increased tension, although China has so far limited its response to diplomatic protests and statements at the UN. I think that's pretty commendable, given China could respond militarily or economically, but instead it is relying on diplomatic pressure, which is what everyone thought that the US could have been capable of in the first place. But I mean, alas, their hubris may have gotten in the way there a little bit. So at the same time, Venezuelans are suffering. The economy was already strained by years of sanctions, mismanagement, and underinvestment. The added pressure now of blockades and military action has worsened shortages of food, fuel, and electricity. Venezuelan authorities have deployed armed groups in the capital to enforce order, but the sense of instability persists as people feel frustrated by the US interference in their country, knowing full well that they are there for one thing and one thing only. This approach signals a willingness to disregard rules whenever it is convenient. So, diplomacy, trade, or negotiation are options that are consciously ignored in this case. Instead, the US relies on its military, on economic pressure, and international leverage to achieve its objectives, even to the destruction of other nations. It justifies this action as necessary for national interests or energy security or stability. The framing may sound legitimate in Washington boardrooms or in Congress, but it is illegal under international law. Sovereign nations have the right to control their resources, and their borders are meant to be respected. When these principles are ignored, the entire international system is then weakened. And the threat is not just to Venezuela, it is to global peace. Other nations may feel the need to respond with their own aggressive measures or sanctions or militarized protection of resources. Smaller countries with valuable assets and are forced to consider whether their sovereignty is truly respected or whether they are merely targets for extraction. And with that, risk of escalation grows and diplomacy becomes secondary. Okay? International law then becomes conditional. The default expectation shifts to something like, if a stronger nation wants what you have, you might lose it. What amazes me is that the US really doesn't understand how much of a regression of to society they are ushering in with this behavior. Our ancestors have been there before and clearly didn't work out. So did we really not learn anything? America's current approach really shakes the idea of a rules-based world. You have institutions meant to enforce peace, mediate disputes, and hold countries accountable, but right now they barely matter. The US just moves around them and other nations, whether they are friends or competitors, and everyone is just expected to accept it. That sets a tone. Power becomes Power comes before law, profit before ethics, and negotiation is secondary to pressure or force. Countries watching this see that breaking other nations' sovereignty can have few real consequences if you are strong enough, and that is how instability spreads. Venezuelan oil shows this clearly, but it isn't the only case. Across the globe, resources, strategic ports, or political influence are prioritized over the rights of citizens or the sovereignty of states. People try to sell it as necessary or pragmatic, but really it's a choice. Nations choose profit, influence, or control over law, over fairness, and over people's lives. And the ones who pay the price are always the ordinary people, the families in Caracas or any city caught in the middle. Their governments are weakened, their economies are disrupted, and their futures put at risk while foreign powers and corporations collect the rewards. The question here is clear. Is this how we want to live in the world? Are we comfortable with the idea that a so called powerful nation can take whatever it wants, whenever it wants, with minimal consequences? And are we willing to accept a global order where might makes right, where diplomacy and mutual trade are secondary, and where the wealthy and powerful profit at the expense of the majority? For Venezuelans, the answer is no. The rest of the world, the answer should not be yes. True global stability requires adherence to law and respect for sovereignty. It requires negotiation, trade, and cooperation, even when national interests are at stake. Forceful resource extraction, as demonstrated in Venezuela right now, threatens these principles. It concentrates power and profit in very few hands, while the majority of people, both in the targeted country and abroad, lose trust in the system. The longer this approach continues, the more normalized it becomes and the harder it will be to reverse. America's actions in Venezuela are a warning to the world. They illustrate how a powerful nation prioritizing profit and control over law and ethics can destabilize an entire region. They show how ordinary citizens suffer while corporations and politicians benefit. They demonstrate that global peace is fragile when one nation believes that it can act above the rules. And if it is allowed to continue, the implications will extend far beyond Venezuela. The bottom line here is simple. Global peace cannot thrive when one country assumes the right to take what it wants. Respect for international law and sovereignty is not optional, it is essential. Allowing the United States or any other power for that matter to act as if the rules do not apply is a direct threat to every nation around the world. Venezuela is a warning. The question for all of us is whether we accept a world where might makes right, or whether we insist on a system where law, justice, and respect for sovereignty guide international relations. I think that we should not accept the first option. We must insist on the second, because if we do not, the consequences will extend far beyond Venezuela, and the cost will be paid by ordinary people everywhere.